When I look at our history, I realize that our history is not negotiable. It's not defined by slavery. It is a profound history, and we need to teach it in honesty. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry for the little bit of a delay. A little delay getting on tonight. Excuse me. As you may or may not know, I have been a little ill over the last few weeks, so I have not been as had the ability to do the show as faithfully as I would have liked to over the last few weeks. However, I am on tonight, and I am ecstatic to be on with you tonight for another episode. If you are new to this program, this is the Erudition Network. My name is Eddie Phillips. I am the founder of the Erudition Network. The Erudition Network is dedicated to teaching Black history and history in its whole, factual history in its whole, that you may not have been exposed to or had limited exposure to in school or just in general. I am on every night. I am a public historian. I'm on every Thursday night, not every night, but every Thursday night to provide you insight and to spark a interactive conversation about Black history and get us to talk about some of these things that have been hidden from us in this current environment where many people don't want to talk about history, even though it directly affects us. This is a place for you to come and get factual history that you can go and vet because it has been vetted and be informed. I ask you to please share this broadcast if you come upon it later and are not a part of the live. Please feel free still to go and share it on Facebook, on YouTube, or wherever you do your social media so that more people can be informed and more people can join our conversation. I'm going to give a moment here because I know that we were a little bit late getting on and I wasn't on last week. And again, I apologize if there's a little bit of croakiness in my voice. I'm trying very hard to get my voice back. That has been part of the problem over the last few weeks. Can't really do a podcast or do a program when you can't really speak and you're having issues with that. But I wanted to make sure that I got on here tonight. Tonight is my third oldest son's birthday. He is 16 years old today. For Elliot, I want to wish him a happy birthday. When I get off here tonight, we're going to go and further celebrate his birthday today. But I definitely wanted to say happy birthday to my son. It's hard for me as my sons get older to see them as older young men, but you know that's a part of growing up and everything else. So I am so happy that God has allowed him to see 16 and to be blessed enough to be prosperous as a 16-year-old and doing well and thriving. So happy birthday to him. If you are joining us tonight, please feel free to jump in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from. Let us know that you're watching as we get ready to go into this lesson tonight. As I do every show that we do for Erudition, I am going to open this program with my general first thing that I do is opening the program to your questions. Questions are important. This is an interactive program, and I like to get information from you all as well as give information. A lot of times we don't realize the benefit of reciprocity and how we share information and we go back and forth. That is information being passed, and we all grow from that. And so, joining in on a program and providing something that a question or thought or something that you have been confused about in history, whether it be Black history, whether it be general history, whatever it may be. This is the program to come on and talk about that. If we can't answer it in this one sitting tonight, then I promise you we will go and we will do a show on it later, because I believe that we should be sharing information between each other. So I want you to please feel free to drop your questions, ask your questions, or whatever it may be in right now. As we wait for others to join, if other people are going to join us for the live tonight. And if not, within the next few minutes, and I'm just going to go into what we're going to talk about tonight, which is a furthering of what we talked about over the last few weeks, and talking about Red Summer. As you formulate your questions, let me tell you what led me to the idea of talking about 1919 over the last few weeks. 1919 is an important part of Black history, Black American history. And it is something that we often either we don't know about, it has not been taught in our schools. But at the beginning of the 1900s, as you looked at 1919, this country was going through a change. We had come out of the 1800s, out of the Civil War, out of Reconstruction, and the country was trying to work more globally. We had come out by 1919, coming out of World War I, one of the Great War, which took many, many lives. And 1919 is an important point for us to face, because even though the Treaty of Versailles talked about universal peace and the forming of nations and how people would get along to prevent wars and hostilities, Black men had been taken over to war. They fought for the United States. And when they returned as veterans, they had to defend the rights in their own homeland. Whether you look from the fields in Georgia all the way up to the streets of Washington, D.C., people were fighting for their lives. And it is something that when I bring this up with people, they don't know. And so over the last few weeks, after a conversation I had with a gentleman, I realized we have to talk about this. We had to talk about 1919 as it affects us even today. The attacks of Red Summer in 1919 were throughout the year. We call it Red Summer, but the reality is it went on. That was the name derived by James Weldon Johnson to kind of encapsulate the attacks. But it was a button year in racial attacks in this country, in the North, in the South, and all over. Rather it was military being attacked as they came home. Rather it were civilians who were being attacked. Rather it were Black people doing the great migration from the South due to violence to the North. It was a time of violence. A time of violence. And it was indiscriminate and where it was and how it happened. But unfortunately, as we go through and we go further through Red Summer, we will find that a lot of it can be explained. It could be explained by the white and black servicemen who were returning from war. They saw black men who had been soldiers and been treated as equal citizens in Europe. They saw the return of them as something that was a threat. They had already pushed aside the idea and the equality set by Reconstruction. They had already gone into the Jim Crow era and the idea of racial subordination. They had already gone into the idea of subjugating. So when people came back with their heads up, feeling that they should be treated as men, this was unacceptable. We talk so much about nowadays about DEI. We talk so much. I guess none of you had any questions, so I'm going to remove that as we go further into this lesson because I gave you room, but you can ask questions about what we're talking about or throughout the program if you still have any. But I really don't think we have a very big understanding of how in this era where we say equal opportunity, DEI, whatever your catchphrase is, we have to understand that the reason why these programs and these laws had to be instituted was because people failed to treat minorities correctly. They failed to treat black people correctly as they came back with the same rights as the white service member. They failed to treat them with respect. And people like W.E.B. Du Bois and institutions like the NAACP made a point that if black men and black troops could honorably go and fight over in Europe on the behalf of the United States, if they were fit enough to wear those uniforms and proclaim themselves to be a defender of America, then they should be fit enough to do everything else that was given to a citizen of the United States. But that was not what they returned to. They returned to oppression, to fighting, to murder. It had gotten so bad during the time of World War I, during the time of the Spanish flu, that it is estimated that by the end of 1919, more than 1 million African Americans had left the South and gone north. In Chicago, because we have a lot of friends and family in Chicago, the population of black people went up 148%. A lot of the African Americans and black folks who are in Chicago right now, you are the ancestors of those who fled. In places like Philadelphia, which we will talk about a little bit tonight, it went up 500%. And when you, good to see you, Dad. Yeah, Ellie's birthday today. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. But let's understand how that works in relation to who we are today. When you look at the migrations that were happening because of the intolerance, because of the violence, there was pushback in these areas which 50 years before had been the strongholds of abolitionists, of people who said that blacks should be treated or freedmen should be treated fairly and that slavery should be outlawed. But just as Dr. King said, just because you don't kill me don't mean you want me to do better. People were fine with the idea of people not being slaves, but they didn't want them to be their competition. The competition that came through blacks and whites during Red Summer, during 1919, created an anxiety as people were afraid that, well, with all these black folks coming up here, they're going to take our jobs. Sounds familiar? Does it sound like something that we're seeing and hearing about with migrants? They're going to take our jobs. They're going to take our ability. So what they did is they went violent. Between April and November of 1919, we know of at least 30 racial riots. 30 racial riots. There were hundreds of recorded lynchings. And there were massacres of black people from Arkansas all the way up to Maine. And yet, we don't really cover this in our history. We need to understand our history and how it relates to where we are right now. During the time of Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan was shut down. And it was during the early 1900s that there was a resurgence. Such a resurgence that by the 20s, it was estimated that 1 in 10 Americans nationwide, were a part of the Klan. I see you there, cuz. I see you there. Yes, Coldwater, Mississippi. That's our family. It is important, ladies and gentlemen, as we cover these topics, that we understand that many of our families were affected by the events of 1919, the events of the 20s. We often talk about the Great Depression and how people transited, and there was great migration during the Great Depression, but for blacks, it was before that. Coming out of one of the bloodiest wars in history, at the time, the bloodiest war in history, where they had distinguished themselves, black people, black men and women, had to come back and be denigrated. They had to form self-defense organizations within their own communities to keep racist whites out from burning and destroying what they were building. These small freeman towns that had came up after Reconstruction. It can be argued that without the return of black male troops after World War I, we may not have seen all of the violence immediately that happened in Red Summer. We say we trump and we celebrate soldiers as they come back. W.B. Du Bois talked about how these men should be received. But what we experienced was violence. To a point that even in our nation's capital, black men had to take up arms and defend their communities just miles from the White House, from the Capitol. And yet, when you ask many people about Red Summer, when you ask many people about what happened during that time, they can't tell you. I've had people tell me, I don't even know what it was, man. And that's not a fault on them. It's a fault on the fact of what we're not teaching. and what we're not relating. 5,000 Black veterans in DC had to stand up and understand that the only way to defend themselves was with themselves. Because see, DC had Howard University. It had a thriving Black middle class. People were coming from the South and getting jobs, porters, shop owners. But when you read about the horrors of that time, where people were being chased down the streets and chased into restaurants and facilities, I had a World War II veteran once said, before they shut his mic off at a time when he was speaking, he was being honest, white World War II veteran. He said that his father was for the Blacks until they started rioting in the streets. But he neglected to understand that the reason why they were fighting in the streets was because they were being denied their rights. And this old 90-something-year-old man still didn't understand that concept. And the whites who were in the room hushed his mic up, apologized, and pushed him on off the stage. And we honored him as a veteran. But it showcases something that we need to know, something that we need to take a personal thought into. So tonight, I'm going to go a little further. I'm going to share a couple of pictures with you, because my wife says she likes pictures. And we're going to talk about maybe 3 incidents during the time of Red Summer before I get out of here tonight. And we're going to go further next week, God willing, with me being able to get on and go further into this. But I want us to talk about this tonight. And I want you to share this program with folks so that they too can be informed. First picture I'm going to share here. This is a picture of Roger and Samuel Courtney. Roger and Samuel Courtney were tarred and feathered. April 26, 1919. Unfortunately, there are not many historical records on this, but we know that it happened because of pictures and secondary sources and people talking. But on the night of April 1919, April 26, 1919, around 2 a.m., about 100 white students at the University of Maine decided that they were going to pull Samuel and Roger Courtney, 2 Black students who were originally from Boston, and they were going to pull them out of their dorm. What happened was the brothers got away initially. They were able to escape. But the mob then chased them and captured them and forced them to come back to campus, which their boys had gotten away about 4 to 5 miles, and forced them to come back with horse halters, if you know what a halter is, on their necks. They forced them to come back as if they were animals. They took them to a local livestock viewing area around the campus that still stands today as another building. And what they did is they shaved their heads. They stripped them naked, even though it was very cold that night. And they were forced, not the people, but they were forced to pour hot molasses on each other, to violate each other as brothers, and to take feathers and put it all over their bodies and then stand for pictures. And what you see here is them standing here humiliated. The police, who arguably came after everything had been done on time, many believe police were aware and were involved, but in order to try to clean it up, they showed up before any murder happened. And no one wanted to report this in the local papers. And when it was discussed by agencies such as the NAACP and others, that is when the university administration in 1919 tried to come up with an excuse, tried to say that the brothers had done something wrong, or the brothers had violated some rule at the university or whatever. And they tried to sweep it under the rug. Neither one of the brothers stayed at the school, and neither graduated out of the University of Maine. But what is important for us to know about this case, the reason that I bring this up about 1919, is that this was Maine. What is the saying politically? So goeth Maine, so goeth the country. You heard that at the conventions over this last political season. So goeth Maine, so goeth the country. They targeted these young men because, one, they were good students. They were good athletes. And because they were good students and good athletes, and they were attractive, the fear was that white girls would be attracted to them. We know this from some of the subsequent interviews and things that people have said about the case. Jealousy led these men to treat these young black men this way. It should also be noted, as we talked about earlier, that the Courtney brothers also were veterans. These young men had fought in World War I and were using their benefits and their ability to go to school in Maine. But this was the humiliation put upon them. And this is something that we have to really look at as we look at our current situation in this country. We ask ourselves why black men seem to be at the lower rung of education. We ask ourselves why they feel that they are under attack, even when they're good athletes, even when they're good students. They are profiled. They are attacked. And history shows us that when you are attacked like that, who wants to stay for that? It discouraged these young men to drop out of higher education. It discouraged these young men, even though they lived. And let me say something else to you all tonight about the history that is not shared. How do you share to your children that white men stood in a animal arena and made you embarrassed and harm your own flesh? How do you rationalize serving in the military for a country and come home and be treated this way?
some results.
But this is what happened. And this is unfortunately a part of Red Summer that you aren't taught, that is not passed in our schools and in our programs. So we don't know it. And because we don't know it, we allow things to continue in different ways. They may not be tarring and feathering young Black men, but we hear about the racial and verbal attacks, the auctions that have been done in these schools and in these high schools, nooses and things being found on campuses, being profiled and pulled aside as an athlete because you were bigum, as they call them. And yet we pretend that we don't understand why a country would institute affirmative action, diversity, equality, and inclusion. We act like we don't understand these things because we don't study them, because we don't share them. And unfortunately, what happens is we go further and further down a rabbit hole of foolery. The reports that were put out about these young men, in order to dissuade it, they said, oh, it was hazing. Oh, it wasn't racial, or it wasn't this and it wasn't that. No one was arrested. No one was charged. But the truth is, if you're Black, even to this day, and you look at the faces of these young men, you know exactly what that was. So these reports mean nothing, except because lynching always is used to send a message, except to inform, hey, we got him. A wink and a nod, while we deny what we did. This is just one example that happened. And I wanted to talk about it because a lot of people don't include it when they talk about Red Summer. They say, well, it's not really a large scale lynching, but it is important. Because these two young veteran men were profiled in Maine, where just 30 to 40 years before, people talked about the fair treatment of the Negro until they got tired of it. Because just like Reconstruction, the abolitionists wanted the Black man to be free. Some claim they wanted him to have the vote. Some claim they wanted to outlaw slavery. But when all of those things were done constitutionally, and the Black people were put on equal footing with whites in this country, they did not want that equality. And the rhetoric from even older abolitionists and suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, who had stood on some of these dioceses with people like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, turned their backs and called the Black people savage. So by 1919, the early 20s, you could find people who had a liberal mindset, but still didn't see Blacks as equal and didn't want them to be around their precious wives, daughters, or families or communities. and wanted to let them understand, wanted to make sure that they understood that Jim Crow and racial subordination were still the unspoken law of the land. I want to go into another incident, but before I do that, I want to talk about a peculiar thing that happened on May 5th, 1919. It wasn't planned to be something that that was supposed to necessarily open the door to the violence of the year, but it is an important thing. On May 5th, 1919, there was a national conference on lynching. It was arranged by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That organization had been founded in 1909 after the Springfield riots, murderous riots, as well as many other murderous riots that had happened during the time. And because of the amount of lynching and racial intolerance that had been going on for years, it was decided in 1919 that they would have this national conference on lynching. And it wasn't just blacks. There were politicians, there were ministers and different folks who were invited to be there for this particular conference, because the primary objective was to pass the Dwyer Bill. In past episodes, I've told you all that the Dwyer Bill was the original bill that was supposed to be used to outlaw lynching. It was proposed by the representative from Missouri named Leonidas Dwyer, a man whose name is forgotten in history too. The aim was to make lynching a federal crime, across the board, rather black, white, or whatever, and to allow the legal system to do what it was supposed to do, and not allow citizens to believe that they could circumvent the law, predominantly to protect African Americans, but also whites who had been the victims of lynching. It was a 2-day conference held in Carnegie Hall in New York. Had a lot of press. It drew probably around 3,000 to 5,000 attendees, arguably. And it was an event that was groundbreaking at the time because it was interracial. It was interracial. It was bipartisan. It were people from all sections who were just tired of the scofflawness of America. Yet, what it did is it opened up a door. One of the speakers who spoke there was a man named Charles Evans Hughes. He's forgotten, except probably by historians, because he was the 1916 Republican presidential nominee to run against Woodrow Wilson, who I told you is probably our most racist president ever. He had also been a former Democratic governor of Alabama. So he understood Jim Crow. He understood racism. But he also understood that the country needed to move forward. People were focused on the honorary service of African Americans. There was a man named General John H. Sherburne. He was commander of the Color 167th Artillery Brigade. And he talked about in this speech, and you can go pull these speeches up, the service of Black people and how faithful they were in defending this country, to showcase the patriotism and the worthiness of our ancestors. James Weldon Johnson, the man who wrote what is called the Negro National Anthem, you know, the very national anthem that when they play it at the NFL, people get mad and say, well, why are they playing this? But James Weldon Johnson, though he was a great writer and a great astute academic, he also was the field secretary for the NAACP. And he was chosen to address the crowd at this conference and talk about the new Negro, as they called it. A black man who was not seen as an animal, a black woman who was not seen as an animal, but as a citizen, as a contributor to America, to society, to the world. Johnson's words and his thoughts that night were not his usual quiet, demure demeanor. It was a man who understood, because he had seen the reports and seen the results of blacks being lynched all over the country, an impassioned cry to change the path that America was on. The issue with that is that even after this major conference, even though growth for the NAACP grew, our membership grew, even though public awareness of lynching grew, all it really did was showcase the problem, but not fix the problem. Not fix the problem. It is sad that we sit here even today, barely years, out of people still talking about, should lynching be a federal crime? And that was all the way back 100 years ago that people were passionately telling you. And we still have senators and congressmen who will argue against making it a federal crime. If you don't think that history has its point even in your life, you're wrong. James Weldon Johnson had gone to talk to President Harding, the previous president, and pushed him on the Dwyer bill and begged him to support it. And Harding died. And when Coolidge came in, he said nothing. Nothing. And everything kind of went quiet. The idea of treating man with respect, treating men as if they were human, just was not the thing. It was not being done during those times. And we're still dealing with that right now. We're about 20 minutes out, just outside of this end of this program. You guys been kind of quiet, those who are with me. If you have any thoughts, comments, questions, whatever, please feel free. I don't like to make this just me talking and pushing a lesson, but I thought that this lesson needed to be taught tonight, because it amazes me how many of us don't know this history, and we have many, many, many more parts of it to go through. I could never get through it in one night. And so that's why I'm breaking it down in parts and pieces. The last thing I want to talk about tonight, though, is I want to talk about Philadelphia. Philadelphia. You heard me say earlier that Philadelphia, during the Great Black Migration, was one of the cities that was greatly impacted by the flood, if that's the term you would like to use, of blacks entering Philadelphia during the Great Black Migration. Um, the issue with that is that the people left to come to Philadelphia because of the rise of the Second Klan, because of the desire to get away from racial violence. In my own family, I have a great grandparent who was killed whilst his sons were fighting at war. These jealousies exist and they are real. And when we look at the decade, rather you looking at 1910, 1920, you see how people flooded urban areas. And initially, the folks of the South, the racists, were like good riddance until they didn't have workers to work their factories and their fields. And then they wanted to try to draw people back. They wanted to try to lie and misinform and tell people that, oh, no, you can come back. Well, the riots in Philadelphia, the race riots in Philadelphia, they happened because of migration. They happened because of that 500%, right? They happened because all of these people, the 611% that went to Detroit, the 148% that went to Chicago, the 66% in New York, and so on and so on. And people got jealous. People got mad. Even the most liberal folks were like, they're coming in and they're taking our jobs. They're taking everything from us. We're not going to be able to survive. The Irish, the Italians, siding with racists, decided that, yeah, we too should fight against this incoming swarm of blacks who are going to change the way we live our lives here in these cities. And though that did happen, though it did change, but I would argue never for the negative. And the results are riots. Riots. Now, this particular picture is not from the 1920s, but it gives you an example of how much destruction people are willing to give, because you can't really find too many pictures of the Philadelphia riots. People don't want to take pictures of the crimes and the criminal activities that they were doing. You can find some about in the Chicago riots and find the burning bodies and bodies laying on the ground. But as Carter G. Woodson said during his time in D.C., when they were pulling black men out of cars and beating them in the streets. And as we're going to get into next week, when the military people were getting involved in the abuses, this is what is left. This is what is left of your own community, of where you live or where you try to do business. Get to some of y'all comments. Oh, yeah, I know you like graphics. People don't want division between people, but people are more accepting to allow something to happen when they don't have any stake in the game. It's how much division is perpetuated, seeing as how majority of people. I believe that people want to get along. I do. But I also believe that people, they flourish in ignorance. That they try very hard to stay ignorant to the realities of what has happened. It didn't matter that what the 40 acres of the mule tenant, because it doesn't matter if you had a business. It doesn't matter if you fought for this country. It doesn't matter what you did. You were unequal. In the minds of folks then and in the minds of far too many people now, you are unequal. It's important to note that the riots in Philadelphia happened 5 days, arguably 2, after the 5 days from the start and 2 days until the end of the conference on lynching. It's crazy because the racial tensions caused by blacks coming in just to get jobs, they decided that they were going to attack. And unfortunately, the flashpoint was because simply black residents, black people, increasing their presence in white neighborhoods. That's what happened. And if you don't think that that still happens today, think about Ahmaud Arbery taking a run through a predominantly white area. All of these cases of we're finding sundown towns, but Philadelphia, a place which is the start of our country's democracy, decided that it would be better to be violent. What happened was a bunch of white men decided that they had enough. And they came to a place on 2335 Pine Street in Philadelphia. And they had a target. There was a man named George Graham. They had only moved into this property. They'd been there probably less than a week. And the mob wanted to remove them out of their home because they felt that black people should not live here. And because this had been a pattern, right? Because this had been something that they had gotten away with, the use of force by large groups of whites was acceptable. It was actually permitted by the police. And it was a common tactic. And it caused a major incident. It caused a racial riot. And because of the violence in Philadelphia, we started to see it expand to other cities. Historians will tell you that the violence in Philadelphia was not as violent as, say, Chicago or DC, but it was a turning point. 2 to 3 days after a national challenge to lynching and violence, people decided they were going to go and pull a black family out. But there is something significant with this too. What happened was blacks decided they weren't going to take it. And they were going to fight back. Even if it meant that some of them would die, be hurt, they weren't going to be disrespected. And as you look more and more into Red Summer, as we go more and more into this topic, you will find that the service of blacks during World War I sent a lot of black men back with confidence that they could defend themselves and that they could defend their families. And it took legislation. It took states' laws and everything to push these people down because they refused to be treated as secondhand citizens. George Graham and his family didn't do anything wrong. This was his right. This is who he had the right to move into this neighborhood, to live his life. But that didn't stop large amounts of whites coming in. I'm reminded of a movie I had my boys watch, and you can only really find it on YouTube. Well, only place we could find it before was on YouTube. It's a Sidney Poitier movie, and it is. I'm going to see while I'm talking to you, if this movie is even still on here. It's called No Way Out. I ask you to go on YouTube and go pull up that Sidney Poitier movie and reflect on what we're talking about with Red Summer and how Richard Widmark and Sidney Poitier in that movie. This movie was made in 1950. But there's a line in that movie, I won't tell you when it happens, where he says to the racist, "Don't worry, white boy, you gonna live." Despite everything that has been done. Because there was still this desire to have reciprocity, to have a connection, as my wife wrote in her comments, to be together. But unfortunately, it wasn't with everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me tonight. I appreciate, getting back to doing Erudition and talking to you all and doing these sessions. We had 6 or 7 people here tonight. I saw Tina, I saw my dad. Please, if you haven't, let us know that you were watching this. Let us know that you're there, so I know who to send my shout outs to. I didn't want this to be one of those lessons where it's just me talking, but sometimes it works that way. And I want you all to learn from it. Share, 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 share. Next week, we're going to go even further. We'll talk about a couple other things. We're going to get down to Arkansas. We're going to talk about some of the things happening on the West Coast. And my hope is to inform you on things that you don't know about, to get you to go out and start asking questions and delving into Red Summer and topics like that. But it is my son's birthday today, so I'm going to try to get out of here, get out to go and celebrate his 16th birthday. I put the ticker on here because I typically forget to do that. If you want to support, help Erudition out in any kind of way, we have a Cash App. It's $ the Erudition Network. Anything and everything that you give is used for our equipment, for our furthering of what we do. We have a couple of books out. My wife has a book out under Tina Phillips. She could drop that in there if she can, so I don't have to type it. I have another book that was out, 101 Black History Question Challenge. Pretty hefty book. Get it on Amazon. Second part of that book is coming out, as well as some other products that we are working on, and you help us in order to be able to do. So whatever you present to us is always used to further educate the many. So I want to thank you all for joining me tonight. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope that you got something from learning about Red Summer, and I hope that you share with others as we grow our understanding and our knowledge. And God willing, I will be back with you all next week. And until then, you be blessed. God keep you. God bless you. And we'll see you later. Thank you.